I sort of feel bad interrupting, like this is a reunion of the old budget, the budget family. So, thank you. Just give people 1 minute while people grab their seats. So this sounds really loud to me. Does it sound okay to people? Yeah. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Maya McGinnis. I run the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, and I'm so pleased you've joined us today for our Better Budget Process Conference Forum. Many of you probably know this, but the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget is a bipartisan organization focused on fiscal responsibility. And if you look at the world right now, where the debt is at near record levels, never been this high relative to the economy since World War II, and the deficit is the largest it's ever been when the economy was this strong, it's a really important issue to be focused on right now. I'm smiling so I don't cry, actually. I was just thinking, I look pretty happy. It's a really troubling time for fiscal policy. There's no question about that. Let me just tell you quickly about two projects that we are doing before I kick off our really great panels and speakers for this afternoon. The first project we're doing right now is something we do every year in election year called U.S. Budget Watch. And what we have started doing and we will continue to do is we look at all the promises that are put forth from the political candidates who are running for president, and we both provide as many explainers as possible in our unbiased, nonpartisan way, kind of explaining what the policies are. And then we evaluate the details and put out the numbers in terms of how they would affect the national debt. And this, we believe, is critically important to try to push a discussion into the presidential campaign discussion that many candidates would prefer to ignore, which is, what are we going to do about this huge national debt? What would the effect of these various policies be? And try to have the discussion that we all know is a real one also, budget constraints. How do these things fit into the overall budget picture? And so for anybody who's interested, we hope you'll look at this. If you go to our website, we have a very big analysis so far of the healthcare proposals of the leading four candidates for the presidential candidates. We will soon be putting out more detailed policy scores of all of the proposals they have, and there are a lot of explainers on there. So U.S. Budget Watch for anybody who wants to see how the candidates are thinking about the national debt. The second project I want to just share with everybody here is something we launched about a month ago, and it's called Fix Us. And Fix Us is a project that's run by my colleague Mike Murphy, who we are looking at the question of how the country got so divided, so dysfunctional, so filled with distrust, how we got to this place, and first we think you have to understand how we got here in order to figure out how to go forward. And what many of you might be saying, which some days I wake up and say also, is, you are a budget group? Why are you trying to fix the entire divides in the country? And it is a fair question. And the answer is, after years and years of working on these fiscal issues and watching how much harder it's become to address them, even while there's a lot of interest on both sides of the aisle for doing something, the real answer is, with the divisions running as deep as they do right now in the nation, it is more difficult than ever to do all the things that you need to fix the debt. So if you think about it, what it's going to take to fix the national debt is a willingness to focus on the longer term issues instead of just the immediate political issues. And it's thinking about the policy answers rather than the political answers. We know that what's good politics is often bad policy, particularly when it comes to budget policy. So it's being willing to put that aside and focus on the good policies. It's being willing to live within budget constraints and acknowledge that trade-offs exist and not falling for the various free lunch economic theories that are out there. And it means a willingness to compromise and work in a bipartisan way. And I would also suggest that those are all the things that actually are required to run a country in a smart way. And it's become increasingly clear that that is not a description of the political moment that we are in. And so we think we are going to spend some of our time and energy and partner with a lot of other organizations looking at what it is that has gotten us to this moment, whether it's political, economic, cultural, institutional, and try to figure out how to bring a lot of people together who care about the government doing what it's supposed to do in a high-functioning way to try to put some pressure to push back for that. So just like the rest of our work, it's completely nonpartisan, not ideological, and it's really interesting. So we hope anybody who's interested in learning more about Fix Us will also go to our website. Fix Us is there, and we welcome people to get involved with that. So now I return to the topic of today, which is budget process. And I think two things stick out glaringly on this topic. One, we are desperately in need of a budget process overhaul. Basically, any area of the budget that you look at, the process, you can see just how broken it is. But also, luckily, there's a companion to that of good news, which is there is truly some real interest in this issue. And I know a lot of times people turn to budget process when they want to avoid the real choices in the budget. We have a lot of speakers coming today. They'll speak to whether they think that's going on in this moment or not. I do not. I think there's a real commitment to changing how our budget process works, and there's bipartisan interest, and there's leadership. So I'm uncharacteristically optimistic and hopeful that we can make some real progress in the coming months on these topics. When I look at the budget process, and I think many of you will share these concerns, you see a process where there's basically no accountability. There is the focus that misses the long term. There's a tremendous lack of transparency. Most people don't understand budget speak. Oftentimes, many of us don't even understand budget speak. Policymakers certainly don't understand budget speak. But it's like it's written in another language to keep people almost alienated from the entire process. We budget by crisis way too often these days. It's almost the only way that we get anything done. And finally, if you look at the fiscal outcomes, they're truly, truly dreadful. So the case that we need a budget process overhaul is not a difficult one to make. I mean, I think the notion that we often run this country without a budget is something that should be shocking to everybody. I think the fact that when we can't get the work done, our political leaders decide to shut the government down it's a punchline. It's incredible that that is what's happening. And I think the fact that we have $1 trillion deficits in a time of economic growth, and there's actually no limiting factor on how you put a budget together, and if you put a budget together, how you put the budget together, what kind of fiscal goals you even have, that there's no requirement of something being included in that. So that's incredibly troubling. And I think all of those things make the case for the discussion that we'll have today, which is we should be considering how to improve the process. So, and again, I will acknowledge, as I think most people will in their remarks at some point or another, is that budget process only works if the people who are doing the budget want it to work. It cannot force any lawmakers to do anything, but it really can help them move along, and we can build systems that allow people, if they care to budget responsibly, to do so. And the good news here is that there are a lot of members of Congress who really do care about this issue. There was the Joint Select Committee, which came up with a lot of good ideas, and it had good interest in all four corners, House, Senate, Republican, Democrats, and a lot of ideas have come out of that. There's real leadership, and you'll hear from those leaders today in terms of putting together process reforms. And there are a whole lot of members of Congress who say, I don't want to be a part of this not passing a budget. My personal belief these days is that there shouldn't be a single member of Congress who doesn't have an idea of where they think the budget should be, pick a reasonable amount of time, in 10 years from now, and how they think we should get there. They're certainly not going to agree. That's not a problem at all. But I think it's really incumbent on any political leader in this country to have a plan for what they think the budget should be. Because just looking at the one right now that is unsustainable, with debt growing faster than the economy and interest payments being the fastest growing part of the budget, no member of Congress should look at that and say, okay, I'm okay with that, and by not doing anything, I'm kind of okaying that process. So that's my hope, that we get to a point somewhere where every member felt like it was incumbent on them to have some thoughts for how we should be budgeting. But that's all you're going to hear from me. I am now going to turn the afternoon over to two tremendous panels, and then we'll be hearing from three senators from their different ideas, the real work they've been rolling up their sleeves and working on this issue. So I'd like to invite the first panel to come on up, and the moderator, Jennifer Shutt, is going to take us through a wealth of experience and knowledge on this panel. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for joining us.
Hello? Okay. Hello everyone, I am Jennifer Shutt. I'm a budget and appropriations reporter at CQ Roll Call. I spend a lot of my time up on the Hill talking with lawmakers and staff, not just about the process, but about the annual spending bills. And so we are here today to talk a little bit about some of the efforts in the past few years to overhaul the annual budget and appropriations process, as well as the personalities, the politicians that are putting those forward, and some of the real-life politics that really impacts this process every year. And one thing I'd just like to point out is that everyone on their tables should have cards that you can submit questions on. So if you want to write down a question at any point during the panel, members from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget will be around to collect those from you. And joining me today is Laura Blessing from the Government Affairs Institute at Georgetown University, Phil Joyce from the University of Maryland, Roy Myers from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and Steve Redburn from George Washington University. And they are going to give opening statements. And we're going to start off with Laura, who's going to talk about what the budget and appropriations process is supposed to look like.
Okay. Legal is what these supposed to look like. Hello, everyone. The formal federal budget process is broken. There are a few things that most in Washington can agree on, but this makes the list. That and Hamilton, of course. And beyond the process itself, there are a host of related problems, lest anyone think that this is merely an issue of hitting deadlines. We've entered an era of trillion-dollar deficits per Treasury's reporting this fall. Continuing resolutions make it more difficult for federal agencies to do their jobs under uncertain conditions. Perhaps the most dramatic accounting of this was then Secretary Mattis's 2017 letter noting that long-term CRs negatively affected military readiness in an era of significant threats, and a hamstrung budget process makes it difficult to set national priorities or to respond to problems of many kinds, while government shutdowns are costly and harmful. I'll kick us off by explaining what the budget process is supposed to look like, with a quick take on how this has fallen apart. A review of the formal procedure created by the 1974 Budget Act reveals a complex, multi-stage process with many veto points. The 1974 Act certainly contained a number of improvements. It took a previously ad hoc process of appropriations bills and created a comprehensive process for discretionary spending, along with new resources, the Congressional Budget Office, and new committees, the budget committees. It imposed a timeline and created new procedural tools. According to the 1974 law, the President releases a budget in February. The Congressional Budget Office submits an economic and budget outlook report to the budget committees. The budget committees create a budget resolution with total amounts of discretionary spending and possibly reconciliation instructions that Congress passes in April, with the House Appropriations Committees deciding how much of that discretionary total the 12 appropriations committees each get. The House gets to work on their bills in May, finishing in June, followed by the Senate's work on the same individual bills, followed by conference committees and final congressional passage and the President's signature by October 1st, the start of the new fiscal year. So to simplify, you've got the President's proposal, the Budget Committee's budget resolution, House action, Senate action, bills go to conference committee, they pass and get the President to sign them. This is the process in theory. When Congress doesn't meet this schedule, they can use a continuing resolution, or CR, to continue spending at current levels, with occasional exceptions called anomalies, to avoid a government shutdown. And in practice, we've seen a lot of CRs, as well as combining individual appropriations bills into must-pass omnibus legislation. We've seen this complicated process progressively break down as Congress has polarized and new procedural problems have been created. Earlier on the hurdle was the Senate, as appropriations bills faced filibusters, so failing later in the process that I just described. But after the 2010 earmarks ban, there has not been a single appropriations bill individually passed into law. The process starts failing earlier in the House. And more recently, the budget committees are failing to pass budget resolutions, so that's even earlier. All of this makes the entire process more leadership-driven, but also more volatile. Budget resolutions in the President's budget are increasingly seen as messaging documents, and more worrisome procedural elements have been added in addition to the earmarks ban of 2010. Controversial amendments can derail the process as members take advantage of a rare instance of open rules to make their mark. The 2011 failure of the supercommittee created a sequestration regime that has significantly complicated the process. And the most worrisome change is the perennial inclusion of the debt ceiling in all of this budget handling, as well as coming to the razor's edge of default in 2011 and too close for comfort in 2013. This is an important topic, and I'm delighted to be here today with such wonderful co-panelists to discuss it.
And now Roy is going to walk everyone through the principles of process reform, impoundment, and the Anti-Deficiency Act.
I was asked to talk about what a better budget process might look like, and that's actually a pretty low bar, isn't it, based on what Laura and Maya said. But I want to set a high bar by referring to an academic article I wrote over 2 decades ago. It was published in the journal Policy Sciences, and which was drawn upon by the Convergence Project. Those of you who were at this summit 2 years ago would be familiar with that work. And it set out 10 principles that I thought would be useful to think about how one could design a better budget process. I'm not going to mention all 10, we don't have time to do that now, but I do want to mention what I think are the most important ones, particularly as they relate to the Enzi Whitehouse bill that the senators will be talking about later. To start with 2 principles that Gephardt Rule has emphasized. One is that the budget should be constrained, that is limiting the amount of money that need be acquired by the government. And second, that it be perceptive, that is looking into the long term as well as the short term. And right now, of course, macro budgetary policy is arguably not meeting those criteria. Now, I don't particularly want to advocate for any path for our federal budget deficit or debt, but I do think it's worthwhile to think about the provision in the Enzi Whitehouse bill that would have the Congress biannually set debt to GDP targets. That's one thing that I hope they will discuss. We also probably should spend a little more time thinking about the long-term risk of climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, in our long-term budget outlooks. In my opinion, though, the even more important principle is that the budget process be judgmental, and by that I mean seeking ways to obtain the most benefits for the least costs. And to do that, we probably have to, at the same time, satisfy 2 other criteria. One is the budget be comprehensive, that is including all the uses of the government's financial resources. And second, honest, based on unbiased projections. And frankly, I think much of the current budget process meets those latter 2, in that we have a reasonably comprehensive budget. And if you look at the excellent work done by CBO and by many budget professionals in the executive branch and on committee staff, they work hard and they try to come up with good estimates and inform elected officials about those. And that's particularly important, I have to say, given that we have a president now who's not really well known for his honesty. The process, however, is not designed to truly identify priorities to meet that judgmental criterion. And in part because the budget is not fully comprehensive in its treatment of tax expenditures. One thing that the Enzi Whitehouse bill does is that it would increase the integration of tax expenditures into the spending review process. It also would create a very minimal but first step towards a portfolio budgeting process that Steve Redburn and the late Paul Posner have written about. In this particular bill, which is a little weaker than what Senator Enzi proposed earlier, CBO and GAO would provide information to the budget committees about portfolios, which would be groups of discretionary, mandatory, and tax expenditure programs within each government sector or budget function, which then could be used to formulate a budget resolution that would be more judgmental. There are some other principles that I could talk about. We won't have time, perhaps, into the questions, but I do want to mention very briefly the impoundment issue. Certainly, one of the major stimuli for Congress enacting the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act was President Nixon's challenge of the Congressional power of the purse. And arguably, we're going through a similar situation now with controversy over reprogramming and transfers under national emergency powers for the wall. We are seeing, of course, the Ukrainian security assistance being the basis for the House impeachment of the president. There also were some arguably questionable decisions made by the OMB counsel and others regarding who could work during the shutdown. That might be a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. So my hope is that given these kind of situations, it might provide more of a stimulus for members of Congress, not just Democrats, but also Republicans, to consider that the institutional power of Congress is being challenged now by this president, and over the long run, that would weaken the individual influence of each member of Congress.
And Steve is going to talk to us now about some lessons learned from international examples in terms of how to get to a functioning, on-time budget and appropriations process.
For 20 years, I worked at OMB, so I was part of the problem. But as you said, more recently, I've been doing some international work, and I think it's given me a new perspective on the way we budget and perhaps some useful new insights. European countries, a number of whom I've visited in the last few months, since the financial crisis have individually and collectively made major changes in their budget procedures. Individually, most have established independent budget offices or parliamentary budget offices, in many cases modeled consciously after our Congressional budget office. Most have adopted a multi-year, medium-term framework for the budget, thereby lengthening their budget horizons, thinking not just about next year, but 3 to 5 years out at least. Many have conducted periodic in-depth spending reviews to find budget savings and to identify public sector reforms that, and in these spending reviews, they've used a growing volume of evidence related to the performance of government programs and alternatives to current programs. And I would say that while these reforms are extensive and much more ambitious than things we've tried in recent years here, this is really a work in progress. It's something to watch in Europe. Collectively, members of the Eurozone have committed to an austere fiscal regime of tight limits on deficits and debt. And in 2012, this was strengthened to impose sanctions on member countries that were not moving toward structural budget balance. National deficits have been held to under 3% of GDP. Drawing on this experience and other international work that I've been doing, I want to highlight a couple of ways in which the U.S. is disadvantaged in dealing with its budget challenges compared to other countries. First, unlike the European community member countries, we cannot count on an external monitor to impose fiscal discipline. Nor can we expect debt markets to signal that they're worried. Last year, when Italy threatened to break with the European regime, interest on its debt spiked sharply. Twice in the last decade, Portugal was unable to refund its debt in private markets, and so the EC, the European Central Bank, and the IMF stepped in to negotiate a reform package and impose fiscal austerity. The U.S. has no such deus ex machina to save us from ourselves. We're on our own. Above us, only sky. Second, in the U.S., the legislative branch takes an outsized role in the budget process. First, the president develops a comprehensive budget proposal. Then in February, Congress tosses it aside or pretends to and develops its own budget, taking 8 months or 9 or 12 to review and revise. In nearly all other countries, it's the executive or the government parliamentary majority that takes full responsibility for budgets and their outcomes, and therefore can be held accountable by voters for budget outcomes. The typical time that the legislative branch in most countries has to review the budget is a few weeks at most. So we're quite different there. Because our budgets are negotiated compromises between the executive and the Congress, there's no one clearly accountable for the compromise. And the easiest fundamental problems, I'm more and more inclined to believe that the budget process reforms cannot be limited to marginal adjustments or treating symptoms like government shutdowns. I think the agenda has to be more ambitious, keeping in mind the kinds of principles of good budgeting that Roy laid out, to include options of redistributing responsibility between the branches and among committees of Congress, revisiting the set of budget concepts and the definition of the boundary of the budget that we've mostly lived with since 1967, and introducing in-depth cross-cutting reviews, portfolio budgeting, to help budgeters tackle bigger strategic choices about how to invest our resources to meet the biggest policy challenges to keep the commitments we've already made. So that's where I come out.
And Phil is going to walk us through state lessons and lessons from past reform efforts.
Great. Thank you very much. So in thinking about the states and thinking about what we know from past federal reform efforts, I really want to focus primarily on what I think are the two biggest problems in federal budgeting right now. The first is the lack of sustainability, which Maya talked about, and the second is the lack of timeliness. And I think most people in this room would agree that both of those are big problems. There are some people outside of this room that don't seem to think sustainability is a big problem, but I think they're wrong. So first about the states, it was interesting when hearing Steve talk about what some of the circumstances are internationally. I think a lot of those apply to the states as well. We certainly can acknowledge that state budgeting is much less dysfunctional than federal budgeting. We can say that without any fear of contradiction. But I don't think there are any procedural magic bullets from the states. First, state budgets, despite what you hear, are not balanced. States borrow a lot of money, and they borrow it for capital purposes. But even in cases where the budgets that are balanced, which is the operating budgets, are in fact balanced, it's not, for example, the constitutions that make them do that as much as the discipline of the financial markets. And that's really the same issue that Steve was raising relative to international governments. The other thing is that timeliness is partly driven by the financial markets, but it's partly driven by the fact that many states are dominated by a single party, which does make decision-making easier, but also the fact that there are a lot of legislatures that are less powerful than the Congress is, that is relative to governors. And I think where you have less powerful legislatures, it is easier to make decisions. When hyperpartisanship does exist, as occurred in Illinois a few years ago, the states are capable of being every bit as dysfunctional as the federal government. The second thing I want to talk about is what lessons past budget reform can teach us. And I think the most important thing to say is that the budget process has never been very good at making politicians do things that they don't want to do. And here, I would quote from CBO in 1993, I see no reason to change this conclusion, quote, "Budget procedures are much better at enforcing deficit reduction agreements than at forcing such agreements to be reached." At the point at which CBO had made that conclusion, it was looking at comparisons between the Graham-Redmond-Hollings process and the Budget Enforcement Act. But the Budget Control Act is yet another example of where the budget process did not actually force anybody to reach agreements. I think the Budget Enforcement Act was successful because there was first an agreement on the path to be taken, and then there were enforcement procedures put in place in order to enforce that agreement. Now that doesn't mean there aren't any kind of budget reforms that can work besides just enforcing agreements. I think those that enhance transparency, those that enhance the trade-offs, as Steve was talking about, between different things in the budget, those that affect the cost of particular activities, as occurred in the Credit Reform Act, or those that affect the quality of information, which is really the main positive effect from having CBO. All of those can have very positive effects. What about recent reform efforts? Well, of course, we know about the Joint Select Committee on Appropriations and Budget Reform. They heard a lot of good ideas. They heard some ideas that were not so good. But in the end, they were not able to agree on much. Now, that partly was because of the specific rules that were created around what they needed to, the agreements they needed to reach in order to get something out of committee. But in the end, the only thing they seemed to sort of coalesce around was biennial budgeting. Now, this didn't surprise me because I'd seen that movie before. In 1993, I was semi-detailed from CBO to the Joint Committee on the Organization of Congress, and they deliberated for a year, and the only budget reform they could agree on was, drum roll, biennial budgeting. But clearly, I think it is the case that the work that was done by the Joint Select Committee has set the stage for some of the reform ideas we'll be hearing from today from the senators. In the end, the biggest problem with the budget, of course, is it's unsustainable, but the biggest problem with the process is its lack of timeliness. I've already described why I don't think the process is going to make the budget reach more sustainable outcomes. And on timeliness, I just have one reminder that I want to leave you with, which is that the 1974 Budget Act moved the fiscal year from July 1st to October 1st because the budget process could not ever seem to meet the July 1st deadline. And I'm going to say that since in only 3 of the 44 years since the act took effect, the appropriations bills have become law prior to the deadline, that maybe that wasn't the problem. Maybe just moving the fiscal year is not our solution. So I think we should be a little humble about what budget process reform can do and what it can't do, which is not the same as saying that we should not focus on those issues where the budget process can really make a difference. Thank you.
So it seems like every year, every Congress, there's a series of bills that come out from lawmakers, some proposing rather incremental, kind of smaller changes to the annual process, and some proposing kind of a sweeping overhaul to it. But for whatever reason, these various proposals don't seem to gain the traction they need to actually get floor votes and to move through the legislative process. So what do you guys see as the incentives for keeping the current process versus really trying to change it either in some small ways or just completely overhaul it?
Okay. So I think the first thing is that we have to recognize that those people who gain power and control from the status quo are always going to be resistant to changing the status quo. And so, you know, for example, the process seems to work pretty well for the appropriators, I think. And so I think the appropriators are a group that, you know, has been generally sort of not supportive of budget reform. The thing that I found a little bit surprising, I would say, in watching the last 2 or 3 years, is that the Congress has seemed reluctant to stand up for itself. And what I mean by that is that, you know, a few years ago there was this whole sort of coalition, I think mainly in the Senate, that was called the Article 1 coalition, that I think was anticipating a Hillary Clinton presidency and was thinking we really need to have the Congress stick up for itself. And I think we've seen a lot of cases where the Congress is sort of willing to defer to the executive branch, and I think that's problematic. And I don't know why I guess I understand politically why that's in the interest of one party, but I think it's short-sighted in terms of the Congress preserving its own prerogatives, which I think are more important than whatever happens to be going on this year.
As a political scientist, I would of course emphasize the great distance between the parties. It's often been known as asymmetric polarization, where the Republicans have moved farther to the right than the Democrats have moved to the left, and arguably the primary results of the Democratic Party in just the last couple of weeks might show that the polarization is going to become symmetrical and that the Democratic Party will move a little more to the left. As Phil said, the internal politics of the House and Senate are such that it's very difficult to convince any member of Congress to change any of the organizational relationships to design of Congress or the process. But that's particularly the case when we have this kind of polarization. What also has happened over the last 3 decades or so is a general weakening of the norms of what it means to be a legislator. In the past, there was just much more emphasis on listening to others and compromise and the like, and unfortunately a lot of that is, if not gone, very, very weak. One of the things we need to think about as a country is what kind of incentives can we give to members of Congress to spend a little more time acting like legislators are being efficient and effective in at least selected states. In my state, for example, it's a supermajority Democratic Party state, so there's clearly an emphasis on the Democratic priorities, but the Democratic Party actually allows Republican senators and Republican members of the House of Delegates to have a say on bills, and I'd like to see something like that in the U.S. Congress.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I think major reforms tend to happen just historically through crisis. So one wonders how much one should wish for such a thing. That's not to say that minor reforms could certainly be helpful. Efforts at bolstering congressional capacity would indeed be very useful. You know, let's pay some appropriation staffers more money to do a very hard job. Let's make more of them. Certainly more ideas there. But there are also a number of different ways that Congress has managed to make this process harder for themselves over time. Procedural reforms such as taking away earmarks, which I'm sure you'll want to get into in more detail later, have been reforms of choice that, fixing those kind of problems would do a lot to improve the process. And I think we need to think of reforms in terms of what are incentives for member behavior. I think a lot of the times when people talk about a budget, they say, oh, let's make sure no one can go home for Christmas, then they'll behave. I'm not sure that the solution is to build a better headlock. I'm not sure that this is our goal as congressional reformers. I want to build a better carrot instead.
And during the Joint Select Committee on Budget and Appropriations Process Reform, when they were working through their hearings and their markups, one of the things that we heard from House Appropriations Chairwoman Nita Lowey was that she questioned how much of it was the process versus how much of it is the increasing polarization and the constant need, particularly for House members, but also for senators to fundraise and to campaign. It's a constant schedule. And there's, of course, always the dynamics with the executive branch. And so how much of this do you think is really needing to overhaul the process, either from a minor level or a major level? And how much of it is kind of the increasing polarization in the American political system in general?
Yes, add 1 minute to that diagnosis. I think it's not just polarization, but the close split between the two parties over and contest for control, since everything is so much on a potential tipping point one way or the other, it makes it harder to compromise, and that's what was holding us back.
Yeah. Steve just well summarized a great book by Francis Lee called Insecure Majorities, which talks about how since the possibility that the House or Senate could flip, of course members are going to have to spend much more time dialing for dollars. And if they're going to dial for dollars, they're going to have less time to spend on actually dealing with the policy problems that confront our nation. So I think you're right to imply that broader structural change in the American political system as is necessary at some level to make it more likely that Congress could be a more effective institution.
Your points on Francis Lee's work are well taken, but I like your setup of the question, which is this a people problem or a process problem? And I think the answer to that is both. That's unsatisfying, I know. I'm not in the business of making people happy, but
Congress,
but this is a process that's very complicated. There's many different veto points, but is the solution to not have a thoroughly considered process where lots of different committees have expert input into what their bill should look like? I'm not sure that's the best solution. I think we could have more incentives to come together and fewer disincentives to come together as procedural reforms. But the fact that you're filtering a set of people who fundamentally have major differences of opinion is something that can't be ignored.
Yeah, what this all says to me is that, by virtue of being here, you all are officially budget geeks, and everybody up here is a budget geek. Budget geeks often think that problems can be solved by changing something having to do with the budget. And I think we just have to admit that a lot of what's going on here is we have a larger political problem. We have a political problem of which the budget process is a symptom, but the budget process is not the cause of our political problem.
So in terms of looking at the White House Enzi legislation, what are some points of that stick out to you as either good and could have a positive impact on the process, or potentially negative elements of the legislation?
I'll mention one, which is portfolio budgeting. I think if I could expand a little bit on that idea, the diagnosis that Paul Posner and I came to, the current process, is it's too stovepiped, it's too focused on next year, it's too incremental and fragmented, and what we need to do is make room in that process for considering how we use resources strategically to address some of our biggest cross-cutting problems and challenges, including things that we didn't anticipate 6 months ago, like coronavirus, for example, things that crop up, and inevitably there will be a stream of those coming down the road. So we need a systematic, in-depth review of our current use of resources compared to major alternatives that could promise breakthrough gain in productivity relative to what we're doing now to solve that problem and to accelerate efforts. There's just no real room in the process the way it's organized now. So the portfolio budgeting idea, which is part of the White House Enzi bill, I think turns it over to CEO primarily. I think some adjustments could help. I want to point to the executive branch, which does a lot of this work already. There are strategic reviews that are part of the Government Performance and Results Act, Modernization Act process. There are other routines that support that. That are the bones, the structure at least of a potential portfolio review process in the executive branch, where I think the analytical strength and the ability to think in depth and comprehensively is much greater than in the Congress, which tends to be scattered.
You comment on that briefly. I had my graduate students compare the Government Performance Results Act web pages for the Obama administration and the Trump administration, and I think they in general concluded that the quality of those web pages in the Trump administration has declined, and their inference was that support at the political level was relatively low compared to where it was at the Obama administration. So I think we also have to think about people at the executive branch, because they need to be part of the solution as well. So the extent to which this current administration doesn't pay as much attention to process as the previous one, the contribution that the Gephardt Modernization Act process could make to helping us determine which programs are effective and which are not, that's an issue we face right now.
I would add, just one amendment, which is that I think the fact that the Enzi Whitehouse bill specifically talks about including tax expenditures in its analysis of comparison of sort of different ways of accomplishing objectives is very important, because increasingly we do a lot of spending through the tax code, and I don't think it gets as much scrutiny. The other thing that I would point to is the idea that you would use reconciliation, and reconciliation would be dedicated to be used for deficit reduction. We've done a lot of increasing the deficit through reconciliation in recent years, and that's sort of contrary certainly to the way it was used in the 1990s.
Our panel has about 5 minutes left, and I went by really fast. I do want to get into the conversations that have been going on for years about earmarks or congressionally directed spending or community project funding, really whatever you want to brand it as. And so it really sounds like if Democrats maintain control of the House following the November elections into the 117th Congress, that they are going to bring back earmarks, which they are mostly calling community project funding. And so how do you think that this will impact the process? And then the other thing I'd like to get your take on is whether or not the Senate, particularly if it maintains, the Republicans maintain the majority and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell continues as the majority leader, what are the dynamics there in terms of potentially having one chamber with earmarks and one chamber without?
Well, I'll address the first part of that question. I think bringing earmarks back to the process, while not without political difficulty, you'd have to have a lot of reforms, probably transparency reforms, similar to what they had in 2007. That would require a lot of both expertise and trust within everyone to bring those back in a reformed way. But I think that bringing back earmarks is the lowest hanging political fruit that could do the most good in the political process. So that's as strongly as I can say it. It brings people together to be able to vote for something on legislation. It gives people a closer tie to their districts, whereas instead of ceding that ground to the executive branch, it makes the Appropriations Committee a more attractive place to be. The idea that you would have people turn down seats on appropriations is pretty bananas, technical term. I think this is an important reform that people should be talking about.
I'm somewhat more skeptical. I would much prefer to set the high bar and move Congress towards portfolio budgeting. I would quote Senator Shelby, who once said, Congress is an institution about little things, not big things, and I think that's a problem. And I don't really believe that their earmarks are going to really change the process that much. If we are going to do them, though, I think we should make them contingent. And my proposal is that earmarks can be put in the bills, but they're only in force if Congress presents the president with all 12 appropriations bills by October 1st.
Just one additional comment. I was talking to a former clerk on one of the appropriations subcommittees once who told me that that when earmarks were sort of at their height, the staff on the appropriations subcommittee spent 80% of their time on earmarks. And I don't think that's what we want the appropriations committees to be doing. I think we'd like for them to be looking to see whether programs are actually working as opposed to spending all their time sort of doling out earmarks. So that's just one cautionary note.
And I think just one last quick question that can possibly be a yes or no. One of the things that I hear from lawmakers, particularly proponents of earmarks, a lot is that it is one very large way that Congress can message to the executive branch that it wants to regain some of its power of the purse, the congressional authority that it has. So do you think that that is actually a valid argument to make when having these conversations about whether or not to earmark or not earmark?
Yes.
If you look at the most recent reprogramming for wall funds, the president took money that were add-ons to the top line requested by the Department of Defense, including in districts that are held by leaders of Republican committees. And apparently they're not too bothered by that yet, which I find somewhat surprising. What they've done by adding on to the defense top line is in effect an earmark. If they're not even going to take them on this, I think it shows again that partisan polarization and tribal behavior is still viewed as pretty important.
Okay, that is it for our panel. I would like to invite my colleague Paul Krozak and his panel to the stage. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Paul Krozak. I'm with CQ Roll Call, and we are very lucky to have three budget experts with us today. Bill Douster, Bill Hoagland at the end, Tom Kahn in the middle. They are not only people who understand the budget, but they've spent many years involved in the politics and the policy of the budget process and the daily work that goes into putting together budget legislation and the skirmishes and the strategy and so on. So just a very brief biographical introduction. Bill Douster is a lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania. He's former Deputy Chief of Staff for Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. He worked Deputy Staff Director, Senate Finance Committee, worked at the White House National Economic Council, lawyer, economist, expert on budget law and Senate procedure. Bill Hoagland, currently Senior Vice President, Bipartisan Policy Center, former Budget Appropriations Director for Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist, spent many years as staff director of the Senate Budget Committee working for Senator Pete Domenici, was one of the first employees at the Congressional Budget Office under the first director, Alice Rivlin. Tom Kahn, currently a professor at George Washington University. He spent 20 years as the staff director and chief counsel of the House Budget Committee working for John Spratt and Chris Van Hollen. He served as legislative director for the American Federation of Government Employees and recently returned from a trip to Gambia where he advised the National Assembly on budget issues. So I'd like to ask our three panelists to start out with brief opening statements, about 5 minutes each, and we will go first with Bill Dowster, and then Bill Hoagland, and then Tom Kahn.
All right, I'm just saying it, we're going to try and be the most fun. Folks before us have the academic credentials, the folks after us have real power, but I know these guys, and we're the most fun. Okay, like Phil Joyce, we've all seen this movie, and we're going to tell you how it's going to end. Bill and Tom and I have been doing these panels together for about 30 years now, maybe longer. We belong to the same witness protection program at Brookings, and as former budget staffers, we're like that old joke among the prisoners where Bill says something and I say argument number 5, and then Tom says he didn't say it right. Our disagreements used to seem so darn significant, but now I find that I agree with these guys about 90% of the time, and the other 10% just not worth fighting over. That may be more a commentary on how Washington's changed around us, become more polarized, where we just sort of stayed where we were. These guys are that good. For one thing, we all agree that the government needs to pay more attention to the deficit and debt. The statute of limitations is run, so I can admit that I worked with Bill on Graham Rudman Hollings. Back then, we both thought that reducing the deficit and debt was important, and I think we both still do. I believe that the deficit and the debt matter for the reason that Herb Stein said, when he said, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. And I also believe in Bob Reicher's corollary, when he said, it matters how it stops. We all know that it's an arithmetic certainty that we can't keep on increasing the ratio of our debt to our income forever. At some point, it gets just too big for the people who lend us money, the one check left on us, the bond market, to take. But remember Reicher's corollary. It matters how it stops. We can plan to stabilize the debt, or the bond market can do it to us. And if the bond market does it, it's much more likely than in financial crisis and recession. If we have a choice, and we do, that's not how we should have it, our debt stop. So I commend Senators Enzi and Whitehouse and the committee for responsible federal budget for focusing attention on the need to limit the growth of debt. The Enzi-Whitehouse bill has a lot of good things in it, like the automatic increase in the debt limit to match the policies of the budget resolution. Having one less manufactured crisis would be a good thing. Ending Votorama, a senseless series of gotcha votes at the end of a budget resolution, would also be a good thing. We have enough disincentives to doing a budget as it is. Now, I guarantee the minority a specified number of amendments, but now I'm quickly. But we're here to tell you how the movie ends. And the 10% of this bill on which there is not agreement is the new special reconciliation process. Don't get me wrong, I don't disagree with reconciliation. Reconciliation is democracy. It's like H.L. Mencken said, democracy is the theory that the people know what they want and they deserve to get it good and hard. I believe that future Senates are going to use reconciliation a lot more than they do now. But in the words of Rebecca Kaiser, reconciliation has been weaponized. It's now distinctly a tool of a majority party. Furthest thing from bipartisan. And so to some, it's a poison pill. So if Enzi Whitehouse is going to pass, we should agree on the 90% if we can, and leave the 10% for another day. Take out the special reconciliation. And the bill stands a much better chance of passing. And while we're at it, let's hold on to that thought that we need to limit deficits and debt and maybe turn some attention to building momentum for addressing the problem of deficit and debt, because I agree in the moral words of Rudy Penner that the problem is not the process, the problem is the problem. When we start to address the problem, that's how we get to the end of the debt and deficit movie.
Go next? Okay. I wasn't going to say anything until I was told that Bill Dowster was going to make some comments, so I figured, well, I better make some comments. More importantly, Paul, I always worry when anybody's introduced as an expert. It always reminds me of Bob Dover defining an expert as a drip under pressure. And more importantly, this is budget process reform, and I imagine the audience out there is thinking, aren't you guys the ones that screwed it all up anyway? So, but being the old guy up here on the, talk very high level for just a second here, and a little bit Roy talked upon earlier, compare the similarities and differences between budget process reform in the past and today. That 74 Act, it came out, as Roy indicated, out of a constitutional crisis. There was a powerful executive, President Nixon. He referred to, in fact, the imperial presidency. He impounded monies that had been authorized, appropriated by Congress, on the argument that the Congress had no real process, for establishing broad, credible fiscal policy in this country. And so Congress was embarrassed. They said he was, unfortunately, he was right. And beginning in the spring of 1973, there was a bipartisan bill, and I quote, to reform the congressional procedures with respect to the enactment of fiscal measures. And that bill was authored by Democratic Senators Sam Ervin, Metcalf, Sam Nunn, Alan Cranston, and Republican Senators Percy and Brocco. So there was a bipartisan start with this whole process. Eventually, of course, that led to the Congressional, I hate to say, recent polling by the economist YouGov finds that that's not the case with the American public today. The rate's very, very low. It doesn't help to have a President of the United States recently say the hell cares about the budget. Ironically, some of the leading Democratic presidential candidates today, including, by the way, do you know that the leader today is also the ranking member of the Senate Budget Committee? Couple all this, it just tells me that the deficit and debts are not an issue going forward. But finally, and most importantly, from my, and I do not want to disparage the Enzi Whitehouse bipartisan bill. It's a bipartisan bill. That's good that they have bipartisanship in there. But I want to argue that, as Maya had indicated at the outset, there's no process reform. However, finely tuned can overcome the polarization and division in the political system today that we have so clearly, and is so clearly palpable, even relative to post the Watergate Vietnam era. And so that's why the project you have underway, Maya, has to address this, I think it's critical not only to the budget, but to democracy going forward.
Two very tough acts to follow. These guys, we've known each other for close to 30 years, and people refer to budget wonks as part of a family, and I think it would be a dysfunctional family if there were. Being a budget wonk or immersing yourself in budget speak in the process reminds me of the old line about if you have 6 months to live, you should immerse yourself in budget wonk and budget process reform legislation. Why should you do that? Because it will seem longer. I also think that, let me just at the outset say that I share the concerns others have expressed about polarization in the country and the Congress. I think it is frightening, frankly. I think it is, we're moving toward a tribal country with one side and the other having utter contempt and disrespect and seeing the other side not just as adversaries but as enemies. I think that is terribly corrosive to the country, and it is reflected in the Congress and terribly damaging. And I really salute the committee for engaging in that, addressing it. I also want to say I believe that the debt is an existential threat to the country, and as the father of two young boys, I worry a lot about the legacy that my generation is leaving for them. And for that reason, I have enormous respect for what Maya and the committee are doing, along with Senators Enzi and Whitehouse. I think we need to focus on the deficit and the debt like a laser beam. However, with a caveat that there are other deficits that we should not ignore, we should address as well. deficits like infrastructure, healthcare, education, and certainly climate change. What I'd like to do is just give you a few thoughts about the Enzi Whitehouse bill, both the pluses and the minuses. First of all, I think that the process for prohibiting the use of reconciliation for debt and deficits is a plus. I wish that the bill would actually be broader and impose the Convened rule of not using reconciliation to add to the debt. I'd like to see that not just for the second budget resolution with reconciliation, but in general for budget resolutions, period, and for certainly for reconciliation. I think that the reinstating the old Gephardt Rule, providing a spin-off from the budget resolution to raise the ceiling, is a great idea. It avoids brinksmanship, which risks default, which would be obviously catastrophic for our country and I think world markets generally. I've come around as a reluctant supporter of biannual budgeting, but only if the appropriations bills themselves are still annual. I mean, the truth of the matter is that Congress has proven unable to pass annual budget resolutions. Bill's history is enviable. I think, having been at it later, last year I was staff director, excuse me, no, actually one of the years I was staff director, we could not even produce a budget resolution. That was in 2010. I do think that biennial may increase the chances that there will be a budget resolution in place. I like the adding the tax expenditures to portfolio budget reviews. It has to be part of the ledger and something Congress needs to be reviewing. And I strongly support the Van Hollen amendment that was adopted, making it harder for the president to use rescission authority near the end of the fiscal year. Like Bill, actually both bills have said, both Bill Hoagland and Bill Dowster, I think it's very sad and very, very scary that the Congress has been relinquishing its power and its authority to the presidency for various reasons. I think a weakened legislature and an extraordinarily more powerful president in many ways is very damaging for the country. And finally, I support the optional budget process, optional bipartisan budget resolution, creating a spin-off resolution to be signed by the president that would codify discretionary spending caps, making it less likely shutdown threats would occur at the end of the fiscal year. I have other concerns about that, which I'll talk about in a second. Here are my concerns. First of all, I am very troubled by and would like to see struck from the bill Title IV, which creates the second reconciliation bill in the second year. I think it is potentially very, very damaging. It would impose or highly increase the chances of imposing cuts on vulnerable people like who benefit from the Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, the Affordable Care Act subsidies for the poor. And the reason is that they represent 2/3 of mandatory spending. You know, Willie Loman, why did you rob banks? And he answered, that's where the money is. And yeah, I mean, admittedly, that is where it is. You know, it is, to be fair, revenue is also an option, tax increases. But I'm afraid that since 1990, one party has not voted for any tax increases as opposed to them as part of their orthodoxy. So tax increases look highly unlikely to me. I also have concerns about when the trigger would be, the cuts would be, reconciliation would be triggered. What if we fall into a recession when spending cuts and tax increases would be imposed at the worst possible time? What if the budget resolution, as frequently happens, uses overly optimistic assumptions about debt in the last year, using magic asterisks, budget cuts Congress never intends to pass? What if the Fed unexpectedly raises interest rates above levels assumed in the budget resolution? And just to give you a flavor of what Title IV would have triggered as a result of the 2018 budget resolution, it would have triggered 3 $3 trillion in spending or tax in cuts in one form or another. I'm not clear why debt calculations don't count offsetting financial assets. And in terms of the second year budget resolution, it imposes, it requires that each committee actually report as part of the directive something that is deficit neutral or cuts the deficit. It seems to me that really disadvantages those committees like the Education Committee, which have few offsets, and it greatly benefits committees like Ways and Means and Senate Finance, where the money really is in terms of the savings. So my bottom line is I think there are positive parts of this bill, and after some significant change, I really do hope it can pass, because I think, as Bill Hoagland just said, the fact that it is bipartisan is really, I think, an achievement, and I hope it continues with those changes. One last thing, I just want to make a personal note, if you'll forgive me, but there's not a week that goes by that I don't want to call our former colleague Ed Lorenzen on the phone and ask him a question about budget process. Ed worked on the Hill for many years, at the committee for many years, and I think this program today and the efforts we're doing is an important way to honor his legacy.
Thank you very much. So the three of you have talked about this Enzi Whitehouse bill. So last year, the Senate Budget Committee approved this budget process reform bill sponsored by Mike Enzi, the Senate Budget Chairman, and Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat on the committee. And in short, this bill would establish a 2-year budget process, 2-year budget resolution. It would keep the annual appropriations bills. It would make various other changes, including some that you mentioned. If both the House and Senate adopted a budget resolution, then the debt limit would be automatically raised if the President signed the bill. And you also talked about this controversial special reconciliation process in the bill. I'd like to ask you about that shortly, but first what I'd like to ask you about is we have had a number of committees and commissions which have tried to reach bipartisan agreement on budget process reform, and none of them have really succeeded until the Senate Budget Committee last year actually approved a bipartisan bill. Now, actually, most of the Democrats on the Senate Budget Committee voted against it in committee, but nevertheless, you had some Democrats supporting it and all the Republicans supporting it. So you all have been involved in bipartisan budget legislation as well as partisan budget legislation. And you go back to the days when bipartisan agreements were not all that unusual. So my question is, how significant is it that Mike Enzi and Sheldon Whitehouse were able to reach agreement on this legislation? Start with you, Bill Dauster.
It is very significant. A lot of those budget deals that we cut ended up being forced, as Laura mentioned in the previous panel, because of crises that forced us to have to cut those budget deals. And I'm seeing that many more of the deals that get cut now are only possible to be cut by the leadership of both parties because they are tribally aligned parties. And it's harder for people to cut deals in the middle in the rank and file and get them through the Congress without bringing along the leaders to make them so. So I think it's a significant step, but it's a necessary but not sufficient start. We also need to make sure that both leaderships are going to be involved if this is going to pass.
Tom?
I think, as I agree with what Bill Dauster said. I always agree with what Bill Dauster said. Even when I disagree, I agree with him. As an alum of the super committee, the Nussel-Cardin budget process reform, for those of you who remember that, and the Simpson deficit reduction panel, all of which failed, I think this is a good start. I think, as I said, I think there's some positive aspects. It's going to be a heck of a challenge getting it, I think, through the Senate, and particularly the House, where there's much less appetite for this type of thing, to be generous. But it has to be bipartisan, it has to be broadly supported. But ultimately, I do think we have to bear in mind that it is almost impossible for process to drive policy, because Congress has will find the most creative and innovative ways to get around any type of requirement, as it has shown repeatedly over and over. Nonetheless, I think there certainly is a value to putting a process in place. Then if worse comes to worse, you can at least accuse the Congress of evading its own rules. So I don't want to sound too cynical. I think it is a positive development.
I think it's significant. I think it's significant, Paul. I wish there were 13 Republicans and 4 Democrats that co-sponsored this. I wish there were more Democrats that co-sponsored this. I think it does build upon, part of the success of this builds upon the fact that we had the Joint Select Committee on Budget and Appropriation about that happened with the White House. He was a member of that. Senator Enzi was not, so I think that says something. Bottom line, I wish Senator Enzi was not retiring at the end of this year, because I do think that makes a big difference as to who's the sponsorship for this going in. Because let's be honest, this is not going to make it out of the House of Representatives this year. So it's still got a ways to go.
Okay, thank you. So the Enzi Whitehouse legislation has this special reconciliation provision, and the way this works is the budget resolution in the first year would set debt as a share of GDP or the economy targets. And if those targets were not on track to be met, then in the second year you could have this special reconciliation process, which, as you said, could be used for deficit reduction only. Now, Bill Douster and Tom, you both are opposed to that. And Bill Hoagland, I'm not sure. Bill, what is your thought on it?
Well, I'm for it. And let me tell you why. Let's go back to the 1974 Act. Bill, Tom, you'll remember. There was not one budget resolution, there were 2 budgets. There was a first resolution, there was a second resolution. Now, admittedly, you're supposed to do both of them in that short time period, the first year. Effectively, that second budget resolution was to bring it into compliance with the first budget resolution if it were out of compliance. All they've done here, from my perspective, is set up the same mechanism the original act assumed, which was that but given more time, that if you haven't lived up to what you said in your first resolution, you're going to come back and clean it up in the second resolution. So to me, I don't have any problems with it.
What's changed is between 74 and 1996, reconciliation was used as deficit reduction. And then after 1996, it's been weaponized into the do whatever the majority wants to do in fiscal policy bill.
Bill and I have had this debate for a long time. I just want to point out one small factoid. I'm very sensitive about this. I agree that you should use reconciliation for deficit reduction. But don't forget that in the spring of 2001, the projection was surpluses as far as the eye could see. The reconciliation bill simply said, return some of that surplus to the American public in the form of a tax cut. And most importantly, Bill, you know this, the law doesn't say it says make changes in authorizations or appropriation. It doesn't say increase, it doesn't say decrease. So I will argue that, and I don't like the 2017 reconciliation bill because that did add to it. But at the time we did it, in the spring of 2001, we weren't using it to create a deficit, we were using it to reduce a surplus.
I would just like to add, as soon as this country starts running surpluses again, I will agree with Bill. I don't think that's going to happen in our lifetime. As I said before, I think that there are a lot of problems with the way the trigger is designed. As I mentioned, there are a lot of outside things that can change the circumstances, even though the budget resolution was done in good faith and was being complied with. As I said before, you could hit a recession, you could hit the Fed higher interest rates, can have magic asterisks. There are a lot of things that can throw it out, and as I said before, I think that particularly if it's a recession, it would hit at the worst possible time when you want to do counter-recessionary proposals.
Bill Douster and Tom, I'm wondering if you could talk about the difference between the current reconciliation that we have now, and you would be able to do that kind of reconciliation in the first year of the budget resolution under the Enzi Whitehouse plan, and then the special reconciliation that could be done in the second year. You're both opposed to that special reconciliation, and I'm wondering why, because it seems to me that it's not that different from the first year reconciliation.
The danger of it is in use with the first year reconciliation. The first year reconciliation, you can worsen the deficit and set up the requirement in the second reconciliation that you have to fix what you did in the first one. So you can get the political credit for doing the bad deed in the first one and have to pay for it only in the second one. And then be much more likely to have to cut programs that are where the money are. To answer your question narrowly, the differences are, one, the regular reconciliation has been used to worsen deficit a lot recently, whereas the second one is going to be constrained under what's called the Convened Rule, saying that you can only use it to reduce the deficit. The time consideration, I believe, is it the same or lower? I forget. But also the amendments that are allowable in the second reconciliation are limited. You can't offer amendments, it's not in order to offer amendments that would reduce the amount of deficit reduction that you're instructed to achieve or has been reported out in the second reconciliation bill. So it makes it very difficult to address in that setting if you wanted to say do half as much deficit reduction or less, fewer cuts in Medicare than you would be instructed to do.
I may be getting confused between the bipartisan bill and the second reconciliation, but Bill, I thought the second reconciliation bill required a 60-vote hurdle. Maybe I have to go back and look, but I thought the second reconciliation bill required a 60-vote hurdle in the Senate. Maybe clarify, or maybe that's just on the bipartisan.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It is the bipartisan one that would require a supermajority to pass. The virtue of it is that it would have spin-offs for the spending caps for 2 years. In the bipartisan budget resolution, that's exactly right. I'm not crazy about the idea. I know we've been doing it since Ryan Murray, but I'm not enthusiastically supporting 2-year budget caps because I worry that you're not going to know in the first year what your needs are going to be in the second year, and the assumptions will change likely between the 2 years. Now, yes, you can do a supplemental, but that's not easy to pull off. So, you know, and for the reasons I said before, I have real concerns about Title IV.
So there is this distinction between the special reconciliation in a budget resolution and then the bipartisan budget resolution that is in the Enzi Whitehouse proposal. Now, this bipartisan budget resolution, this would be an option, and this would be a budget resolution which would require bipartisan support both in the committee and on the Senate floor. There would be some additional options with this bipartisan budget resolution, including setting enforceable discretionary spending caps, which we have grown to know about in the last 10 years or so. Starting, Bill, with you, Bill Hoagland, any thoughts on the bipartisan budget resolution?
My main, I may twist your question, Paul, a little bit. Once we get through the current 2021 appropriations caps and the caps come off, this is going to sound bad for my Republican friends out here. the problem with the federal budget is not the discretionary portion of the budget. I just have a feeling that some of those things that we want to talk about, when you want to invest in, are in the discretionary portion of the budget, whether it's in science, technology, my old saw about seed corn of the future. So I'm not sure I like this idea. I'm kind of looking forward, to be honest with you, if I survive that long, to see the elimination of the caps on discretionary spending and go back to the old-fashioned way of actually appropriating money and arguing out what the level of cap should be, or what the level of appropriation should be. So the one thing I do like, by the way, the one thing I really do like about this bill has always been something that I always felt was necessary, was if you pass a conference agreement on a budget resolution and you already, and in that budget resolution, you have voted on the debt limit, then just send it on down to the president and let's avoid this debt limit fight.
I agree with much of what
I just want to wholeheartedly endorse what Bill Hoagland just said about the fact that discretionary spending is the easiest thing to cut and is the most damaging, particularly non-defense discretionary, where we have a terrible shortage of things that we really need to do.
All right. Thank you very, very much.
To come up and join me on the stage for our next panel.
They want to stand real quick and stretch.
Do you want to stand and stretch? That's very great.
I'll walk to the room and look sideways. Stand.
Well, right before we jump in, I am just going to share that every year, many of you come to our annual dinner, and we go through this whole question of who are we going to have as our dinner speaker? And it's always a big thing to figure out who it's going to be. And my colleague, Mark Goldwine, every year wants to have somebody who has since retired, but was the Economist comedian. Okay? And I always say, that sounds like a really terrible idea, Mark, and so we don't have him. But you missed the last panel. They were funny. So thank you guys for both being very knowledgeable about the budget process and being up for laughs. And maybe we will hire you all as our budget comedians for the next annual dinner. Really. Here all week. Yes, thank you, Tom. I'm now joined by Senator Lang. I'm going to say more broadly than the budget because I've known you for a while and we've had discussions on lots of policy issues. And you're a policy wonk. And you really take seriously thinking about how to craft various public policies and what the incentives are and what the objectives are. And I enjoy those discussions tremendously. It's been focused quite a bit on improving the budget process and overall budget policy. And I think you bring a real rational, sensible, thoughtful voice to the debate. And we're really lucky you jumped in.
This is probably one of the few rooms in Washington that's a compliment.
Yeah, that's right. And where people think it's great. And we're on C-SPAN, it's going to be on at 3 a.m. and you're going to keep the people who are watching budget process at 3 a.m. riveted.
So my nice, low, melodious voice will just lull them right off to sleep, which is the reason they have C-SPAN on in the first place.
Become a regular on late nights. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm just going to toss a couple questions to you, which really are going to give you a chance to talk about what you've been thinking about, what you've been working on. As I said, you have been leading since the Joint Select Committee, before the Joint Select Committee, but through that, on coming up with some of the ideas to address some of the problems of budget process. I guess I'll start with, what do you think the biggest problems in budget process are right now? There's clearly a long list of them, but what do you think the ones that are really standing in the way of doing things that are the most important?
Yeah, so there are a multitude, and that's the issue, is it becomes big in a hurry about what are the biggest problems that we face on it. Obviously, the setup we have for government shutdown, the setup we have for debt ceilings don't work. They're not effective for us to be able to actually deal with budget process. The way that we actually do budgeting right now, that 3/4 of the budget is not actually dealt with at all. So there is this assumption that Americans believe 3/4, that we deal with all the budget and 3/4 of it we actually don't ever touch. That's a very significant issue. The fact that we really don't see a lot of it. The 12 appropriation bills now are 12 appropriation bills that go through committee and may go through committee and process and on the floor in the House, may or may not. In the Senate, they don't go through the committee process, amendment, go through the process on the Senate floor, and they actually come out. So the process that it was even written in 1974 doesn't exist and hasn't existed for years. So the broken process from the Budget Act of 1974 doesn't even exist. It's some strange hybrid at this point, and everyone pretends it exists, but it really doesn't. And so there's a whole multitude of issues there. So everything, including the wheels, have come off.
So everything that could be wrong with budget process is wrong with budget process.
Yes, we're only still using the word budget process, and that's the only thing that's consistent.
And it is an interesting point when you say that about mandatory spending, because I have had so many kind of jaw-dropping moments, conversations with lawmakers, where they've basically not been aware that they're in charge of the other portion of the budget, the mandatory spending, because it really is not part of the process at all. So these huge programs that are driven by aging and healthcare and for all intents and purposes are on automatic pilot, there is really very little sense of the need for the oversight there. So tell us about your legislation on the Prevent Government Shutdown Act, which I think we are very supportive of, and I think has a good chance of moving forward.
So this comes out of years of actually being able to work on this and trying to figure out what would actually work. I don't find anyone that in theory alone likes government shutdowns, but we've done it 21 times over the last 40 years. Both parties have done it. It's been this continual theme. If we're going to get to the end, we're going to have a fight, and it's going to be one of two things. We're either going to have a government shutdown to show we have leverage, which I've yet to see how that gets leveraged, or the second part of it is that if you don't vote for X, then we're going to have a shutdown, so you need to vote for X, when everyone knows there's major problems with X. Both those options are bad options. So I have for several years tried to be able to figure out how do we actually get to an agreement where we don't have government shutdowns, and there's been a lot of these out there. There's been several years I worked on, if we get to the end of the fiscal year, you do a CR, but the CR starts diminishing to apply pressure to everyone to say, okay, we've got to get the budget done because every agency is going to scream at us and is going to say, we can't have another cut in our budget, you got to be able to deal with this. My Democratic colleagues say, you crazy Republicans, you will do that forever. And you will never, ever, ever pass another budget because that's the way you can get a reduction in spending every year. I have some colleagues that they put in a proposal to say if we get to the end of the fiscal year, it just have a CR that kicks in that increases by inflation every year, and it just keeps going until we get it done. And Republicans, of course, are my Democratic colleagues that have proposed that. You crazy Democrats, all you want to do is spend more money. There's no way we're going to agree to that because it'll just automatically increase all the time. We'll never get this done. Ignoring the fact that continuing resolutions themselves are bad in the process and create tremendous uncertainty in the agencies. Maggie Hassan and I, she's a senator from New Hampshire, she and I sat down about a little over a year ago now and said, let's begin with just this basic principle. We don't want to have shutdowns. We want to do appropriation bills. What would be good leverage for us to be able to do that? What we came out with in a whole bunch of conversation to try to figure out how to be able to do this was a pretty simple, straightforward process. You get to the end of the fiscal year, whenever that is. I'm kind of a calendar year guy. Some people still like the fiscal year on it, but it doesn't matter. You get to the end of the fiscal year. If any one of the 12 appropriation bills is not done, or all 12 are not done, you do an automatic continuing resolution that kicks in at that point at last year's level exactly. But members of Congress and our staff cannot travel, and we're in session 7 days a week. and you cannot move to something other than appropriations related during that time period. It puts us in a box to say federal workers are held harmless, the American people are held harmless. We're going to stay in Washington, D.C., and we're going to keep the debate going on budget work until we get the appropriation bills done. Now, I've had folks say, that's really not a pressure point. And I've said, you don't know Congress. Because if we're here 2 weekends in a row, every day, and people aren't out going back to see their district at home, or going to see their family, or going on a Codell, or headed to a fundraiser, or whatever it may be, this place will freak out. And people will start shaking leadership to say, what do we need to do to get the negotiations done so we're not here 3 weekends in a row? If we're here 7 days a week and no one's traveling, not in state, there's no travel, not here, there's no travel, Office of Management and Budget has no travel, we're here until this gets resolved. It's tremendous pressure. That is a very simple way to do it. And for me, it is very similar to what my mom did to my brother and I. That when the two of us would get into a fight, she would send the two of us to our room and would say, you guys can come out once you work this out. But you're staying in there until you work it out. Anybody have that same mom? Okay? So she's an amazing mom, and it's a great concept, and it's the same concept basically on a governmental level. Quite frankly, it's the same thing that happens in almost every state in America. That in state government, if they don't finish their work, they have to extend their session and keep going until they get it done. We just don't in the federal government. We just do a CR for 3 months and say, we'll see you after the election. That's bad for the agencies, it's bad for budgeting, it's bad for our process. Everyone sees that it's bad. Now, the goal is not to have long CRs. The goal is to have very, very short CRs in that process. That's why I say you put the CR in place and it stays in place and we're here 7 days a week until it gets resolved. That has incentive to have short CRs. But it definitely fixes the issue of you don't have government shutdowns. You cannot have a government shutdown under this structure because of the way that it automatically kicks in. So all of those folks that do federal hiring are not having to look at potential hires to say, hey, we'd like you to join the federal family, but by the way, set some money aside in case there's a furlough. That's terrible in all of our agencies. So we've got to be able to resolve that. One more quick comment on this, and we'll go back to your questions on it. I've had some folks that have said to me, well, let's just do a budget, no budget, no pay. If you get to that spot, then we'll just cut off pay for members of Congress or sequester their pay, or I've heard all the different terms on it. Okay, well that sounds fine, except there are many members of Congress that I promise their paycheck from Congress is a rounding error compared to their investment portfolio, okay? They're not worried about their congressional paycheck. Now some are, many are not. That is not an equal motivator. An equal motivator is time. All of us see time as precious. And if you remove time from 535 people and say you get your time back when the first responsibility you have is done, there will be lots of motivation onto leadership and committee heads and others to say, let's finish the negotiations to be able to get this done.
Well, and I will add that organizationally, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget thinks this is a really thoughtfully developed bill, that you've kind of gone through all the details of what makes sense in this, and so we think this is a...
Yeah, it's not just throwing it, there's a lot of other details into it to make the mechanics work.
Yeah, and so what's the feedback you're getting, and where are you in the process? How are you feeling about the likelihood of this moving?
Yeah, it's been very strong. It's been very bipartisan in the process. We have done this Noah's Ark style 2x2 in the Senate, just the way we've signed up on it with one Republican, one Democrat, and continue to be able to add. We've had very good support from many members in the House as well. We're working with Republicans and Democrats in the House. We're trying to actually solve this and to get to a point that at the end of the day, we don't talk about government shutdowns in the future. We talk about what used to happen in the past. So our goal is to be able to run this through. We'll have an appropriations hearing on it in May, and at that time period, we'll go through the committees. We've already had a hearing on it with the Homeland Security Governmental Affairs Committee, which has the federal workforce in that one. That's why it came through that one initially, but it has to go through the Appropriations Committee to be able to work through the process. So all those things are all lined up, and we'll continue to be able to work it through.
And I'm just going to give you an idea that came from one of our panelists on the first panel. Roy Myers had an idea, which I don't know how people have different feelings about earmarks. I'm not a huge fan myself, but there was a discussion on it, and Roy had this idea I thought which was very clever, which was, I think it was yours, Roy, was it? Yeah. Okay, before I give credit to somebody, which was that earmarks would only be permitted for years when all the appropriations bills were done on time, so it avoided the need for a government shutdown. I thought that was interesting because I think part of thinking about all this is when do you use carrots, when do you use sticks? And then the other point I would make is that our co-chairman, I know Leon Panetta, came and testified for the Joint Select Committee and was talking about the importance of really saying the budget is the first step in the budget process, and you shouldn't be able to go forward and do anything else until it is done. And I think he threw his weight behind the idea of also not allowing any bills that really have a real effect on the budget to move forward until the budget is done. So the problem you're solving is a really important one, and it's solvable.
But it's one piece of a larger puzzle. It doesn't solve the whole thing. This solves that slice, but there's still a lot to go.
And that's kind of the attitude we have towards reforms these days, which is go incremental, seems to be the way that has the most chance of working. I think we would love to hear a little bit about your experience in the Joint Select Committee, which I know generated a lot of good ideas, and how you felt about that and where you see the ideas from that.
So it was very helpful. There were a lot of good ideas that bounced out. We got a lot of dialogue back and forth. Some of that's ongoing. Some of those same members from the House that I've worked with during the Joint Select Committee, we're also working with now on this issue about government shutdowns and how to be able to solve that. A lot of great ideas came out during that process and had good bipartisan discussion. As it is typical in one of those, if you don't solve it there, it either all dies or it continues in this subculture. And it's continuing on in that subculture to be able to have real dialogue on that. And so I'm grateful that we went through it. And I'm looking forward now to taking those elements and finding where we had agreement and getting them applied. Again, the House is going through a process now of modernization. And one of the things they're doing this month is actually dealing with modernization and those elements that came out of the Joint Select Committee to see if there's still support from the House for those things.
Yeah, I think, and it seems like they've been getting a lot of buy-in for the work there, and it seems we can build off of that, hopefully. Okay, so in our last minute, I'm going to ask you a question because it is an election year, and we at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget are focusing on trying to get the issue of fiscal issues, fiscal policy, into the national discussion. It is on the verge of taking off, but it hasn't quite yet. I think we've had 675 questions in the debate so far, something like that. Not one of them has been about the national debt. But I guess the question is, how in a period of very hyper-partisan, very divided government on an issue that is as hard as fixing the overall fiscal challenges that we face, do you have any insights about how we move politically on an issue that we all know policy-wise needs to be addressed, but politically it is just such a thorny thing to tackle?
So you've got to get Republicans and Democrats all not just beating each other over the head over issues on fiscal debt and deficit and saying it's all your fault, it's all your fault. You've got to sit down and say, okay, what are we going to do to be able to resolve this? Not to be able to steal the thunder of what's coming after me, but for Mike Enzi and Sheldon Whitehouse to sit down together and to say we both agree there are major problems in budget process and budget reform needs to occur, and we both see major issues in debt and deficit is the kind of model that we need to be able to see around the country. There's not finger pointing saying it's all because of the 2017 tax cuts. That's the whole reason we have deficits. And the other side's not saying the whole reason we have it is because of your gross overspending. It is, we are where we are. We have to figure out where we're going from here as a country. And I would love to be able to see more engagement in the political stage nationally. As you remember, during the 2016 elections, it was the very last presidential debate before a question came up at all on debt and deficit. So don't give up, don't lose heart. There's still maybe more to come, but it most definitely needs to be able to come up because it is a national issue that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and more importantly, thank you for your work on the topic. And so I'm now going to invite Senator Enzi up onto the stage. Wonderful. So you, throughout this entire process today, have been hearing about the Enzi Whitehouse budget process legislation that has been developed. And we are thrilled that Senator Enzi and Senator Whitehouse are joining us to both give remarks about the legislation. We're rearranging the entire House here. And to watch how they've worked in a bipartisan manner as two of the leading thinkers and the chairman of the Budget Committee, and really come up with ideas and really listen to each other and worked on all these tough issues, has been encouraging in a moment where there's not as much as any of us wish to be encouraged about the fiscal picture. So I want to say first, we are sorry that you're retiring. You can still change your mind because we need leaders on the budget process and budget committee to stay around. But thank you so much for the work you've done on this. We're really looking forward to you sharing your thoughts about how it's been and how we can help move this issue forward. So thanks for joining us.
Your organization, all of you have done, but there's more to do. I guess we aren't really started yet, are we? Yes. Well, good afternoon. I thank you for inviting me here. I thank you for your advocacy and the support. One of our problems is there's no crisis out there. I got George W. Bush Institute did a series of papers called Tackling the National Debt. And one of the ones that really struck me was with climate change, there are changes all the time that people can see. And it's got a crisis. With budget, let's see, the economy's good, the employment's up. Oh, we don't have a crisis. Now, when I first came to the Senate, Korea was having a crisis, and I followed that crisis. And the International Monetary Fund helped take care of that once they got their attention. And of course, Greece had a little problem, a lot more recently than that, and I went to Greece and visited with them. Portugal had a problem. Both of those got bailed out by the European Union. If the United States has a problem, who's going to bail us out? Nobody. There isn't anybody capable of bailing out a $23 billion debt. Incidentally, we added $2 trillion more to it with the last omnibus vote. Omnibuses are terrible. That's why we need the Langford bill, so that we don't have the possibility of a government shutdown if we don't just give everybody everything they need. There is a new compromise in Washington now. Compromise is, we'll give you everything you ask for if you will give us everything we ask for. That last omnibus, in one vote with no debate, cost Americans $2.1 trillion. We'll go back to the debate about our earmarks. You know, you could get an earmark provided you voted for the budget, but that's not exactly the way to do it either. Today I'm going to focus on one bright spot in our fiscal front, and that's the bipartisan budget process reforms that were approved by the Senate Budget Committee late last year. Those reforms are the product of years of effort to improve our budget process that began probably before I was chairman, but from my standpoint, with real earnest when I became the chairman. Since the Budget Committee has held more than a dozen hearings on the budget process reform, we met with budgeting experts, including outstanding state officials, and we've listened to insights shared by our colleagues on both sides of the aisle. We've achieved some incremental successes along the way, including changing committee rules to provide for more deliberative consideration of budget resolutions. But it's the bipartisan package, this bipartisan package, which is the first bipartisan budget process reform legislation approved by the committee in a bipartisan way in nearly 30 years. It's landmark, and I'm excited about that. Our bill, the Bipartisan Congressional Budget Process Reform Act, reflects a lot of feedback and ideas that we received through outreach, your comments, and I appreciate all who contributed. Now, I'm very fortunate to have Senator Whitehouse partner with me on this legislation. He worked on it starting 8 years ago with me, doing the budget hearings and coming up with a package. Now, this is a prime time to make budget reform change. Why? Because we don't know who the next president's going to be. We don't know who the majorities are going to be in either house. So, we're faced with the same situation we were 4 years ago, not knowing that. What's the advantage of that? It makes people reasonable. They can picture both sides of that. Oh, I'm in the majority, if I'm in the, well, maybe I better, make sure that it is fair to everyone. And Senator Whitehouse was a part of that. And then not only that, he was on the select committee that was both the House and the Senate. And came up with a good package, but couldn't get the votes to force it to the floor. And we started with that kind of as the base and built from there. Our bill won't solve all the country's fiscal challenges,
It does, however, represent a good faith bipartisan effort to reform the process in a way that encourages long-term planning and realistic and responsible budget assumptions, and an end to the brinksmanship surrounding our country's statutory debt limit. Gets taken care of in this. This bill will also make evident what needs to be done next. This is the only time that something like this can come up because it's before a presidential election, as I explained. I'd like to take a few minutes to explain what's in the bill, and perhaps just as important, what is not in the bill. This is Washington, so there are misconceptions out there, but they're exactly that, misconceptions. But sometimes that can be the toughest thing to overcome. First, our bill tries to ensure that we have better information on which to base budgets. Imagine this for a moment. It would require more active engagement from the tax writing and spending committees to ensure that every corner of the federal ledger is scrutinized and the budgets are realistic. As has been mentioned in the two previous presentations, 73% of our budget is automatic. Nobody votes on it. It just gets paid. We're arguing over the other 27%. So one of the ways of handling it would be to conduct portfolio reviews of federal spending and tax expenditures to improve the efficiency and effectiveness. Now this means grouping projects regardless of which cabinet department is in charge of it. Let me use housing for an example. In the housing area, we have 160 programs administered by 20 different agencies. Nobody's in charge. Nobody's setting goals. I can see the reason for 5 different programs administered by 1 cabinet official. So right now we're paying multiple administrators to argue over jurisdiction rather than the results they're supposed to be getting. Let's put the money on the solution instead of on the bureaucracy. How much money is actually making it out there? Here's something you may not know. There is no list of federal programs. Senator Whitehouse and I requested it from the Government Accounting Office. They requested it from the Committee on Budget and Oversight, and I think we're going to get one. We need one. But portfolio reviews by the different committees, regardless of whether it's in their portfolio or not, I think will lead to reducing the number. Imagine if we went from 160 housing programs to 5. Of course, the 155 lobbying against that are going to be the administrators who would lose their job. They say, well, we've got a good economy, maybe it's a good time to get a different job. Well, that's not a good argument because those people will fight tooth and nail to keep their program. But that would save a lot of money all by itself. Now, second, the bill would reorient the budget process from a yearly to a biennial cycle. Under our bill, Congress would approve a budget resolution in the first year of the biennium that would, among other things, provide appropriators 2 years of discretionary spending totals, similar to the practice we've been doing anyway for a few years. Now, third, the bill would make significant reforms to the content of the budget resolution. Discretionary spending totals would be included in the resolution text where individual members could amend them. Mandatory spending totals would be broken out by budget function so that we could see trends in portfolios of federal spending. If you break out those mandatory programs and show the revenues that go with them, it will be very obvious to see that we have a problem. In fact, if we were to take all of the federal programs that are mandatory and only allow them to be mandatory if they had a revenue source big enough to fund them into the future, how many programs would be left? About 4. And they're ones that very specifically have the money come in and go out that year and do cover the function, or if there is no revenue, it doesn't cover the function. All the rest of them would be off the mandatory list, except Social Security. We're not allowed to touch Social Security under budget reform, but Social Security is no longer paying its way either. We're putting out a lot more money than we're taking in. As we run out of money, that's going to be a problem. So here's something really new. The budget resolution will also be required to include a target ratio of debt to gross domestic product, or GDP, which is generally viewed as the best measure of our country's ability to repay its debt. The hope is that by focusing on a debt to GDP, we could put our country on a glide slope to a more sustainable fiscal future. Under the reform bill, that glide slope would be reducing revenue, reducing spending and raising revenue, or both. The glide slope has to cover all of that, and we would vote on it. And if we vote on it, we should have to stick to it. Fourth, the bill would provide a mechanism to conform our country's statutory debt limit to the levels in the resolution. This would help incorporate the debt limit into our fiscal planning and provide a powerful incentive to ensure that the targets set in the resolution are attainable. Neither side relishes voting have to increase the debt limit, as it's easy fodder for political opponents. Yet, there is nearly universal agreement that the default would be unacceptable. Our bill tackles this issue in a way that maintains the debt limit as a tool to ensure fiscal responsibility while removing that brinksmanship surrounding the potential default. Fifth, our bill would provide a means to initiate reconciliation in the second year of the biennium if Congress isn't living up to its agreed fiscal plan. Now, there's been a lot of confusion about this process, so let me have a moment to explain it. As I mentioned, under our bill, each new Congress sets its own levels for spending, revenue, and debt in its budget agreement, and would not be bound by targets established by predecessors. If in the second year of a biennium, the Congressional Budget Office finds that Congress is not on track to meet its debt to GDP glide slope, then Congress could embark on a special reconciliation process. This is akin to what can be done under current law if you pass a budget resolution in the second year of a Congress. But because we are giving appropriators 2 years of discretionary spending up front, we created a new process in the second year if Congress misses its fiscal goals. Contrary to a misconception that has been circulated, there is nothing automatic about this process. We also applied the Gephardt Rule, which means that it couldn't be used to change Social Security, and we added the Conrad Rule, that changes had to produce positive dollars. The intent of our special reconciliation process is to force a conversation about our growing debt and deficit, not to dictate what the outcome of the conversations will be. Finally, our bill would prioritize budget transparency to give the Senate new budget enforcement tools and remove one of the disincentives to bringing a budget to the floor by fixing the process known as vote-a-rama. That's where we have unlimited amendments that can go on forever, that are usually just to make political points. On the topic of transparency, one of the things I've done as Budget Committee Chairman is to restart the project of filing scorekeeping reports in the Congressional record so that the public can track adherence or lack thereof to budget agreements. Recently, I went one step further by posting these reports on the Budget Committee's website. To make it easier for people at home to access them, our legislation would require these reports to be publicly posted going forward. In general, our legislation does not attempt to prescribe House procedures. That's in deference to the House, who get to set their own rules. I look forward to working with the House counterparts to fill in those procedures. Now, in developing our legislation, I specifically set out to establish a process that would allow us to be thoughtful and deliberative in our fiscal decision-making while avoiding the automatic spending cuts of the last decade known as sequestration. That does not happen under this. Sequestration got a bad name, though, because government had cut the worst first, we might not notice. And Senator Langford gave a speech here just before me, and that is the only solution that I've seen that really will put enough pain in the senators and the congressmen and their staff to be able to tilt the scales toward one party ideology or policy. It aims to create a neutral process to help guide Congress in making reasoned budget decisions. Each Congress will decide what fiscal policies may be necessary, whether that means spending more, getting more revenue, or doing a combination of the two. We cannot be content to bury our heads in the sand as more than $23 trillion debt grows unchecked. As I mentioned, we added another $2 trillion to that a month or two ago. So I want to thank you again for having me. I want to thank your organization for all of your work. Help me to come up with some way that this becomes a crisis before it's a crisis and we have a chance to solve it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Enzi. I do think this is a really important bill, and I'd like to invite Senator Whitehouse to come up and talk about it. Senator Whitehouse is the Democratic senator from Rhode Island. He has been a true leader on the Budget Committee, diving deep into a lot of the issues and really pushing a lot of ideas, willing to work in a bipartisan way, and has been a partner with Senator Enzi on this. And we hope the momentum keeps going, so please come and talk to us about your bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you all for taking an interest in something as dry as congressional budget reform. It's dry until disaster strikes, and then suddenly it's the only thing everybody talks about. There's a saying I've heard out of friends in business, which is, debt doesn't matter until it does, and then it's the only thing that matters. So it'd be nice if we can get this solved until our national debt, before our national debt becomes the only thing that matters. It has been a real pleasure working with Mike Enzi and his talented staff. Betsy McDonald is here, who's been one of his lead negotiators. He's been sort of the guardian angel of this process, holding hearings on this subject over and over again in the Budget Committee, actually helping lobby to get me onto the Select Committee, the bicameral committee, to keep the process going. So this has some very good, positive history in it. It is a trite Washingtonism that the process is broken, which sometimes means that nobody's trying hard enough, or it sometimes means that some special interest has its boot heel on the neck of Congress. But in this case, the process is actually broken. The budget process looks almost entirely at only appropriated spending. It doesn't pass the test of mathematics to get to balance. You obviously have to look at appropriated spending, but you also have to look at healthcare spending that is outside of appropriations. You also have to look at tax spending, all those yummy favors that have gone out the back door of the tax code and sum to more than all of our healthcare spending. And of course, you have to look at revenues. When you put those together, you suddenly get a complete mathematical picture of where we are. So if we're going to solve the problem, you've got to look at all of its elements. And the number one thing that we do is we bring all those elements in. And that not only helps with getting the thing mathematically correct, it also actually helps provide some political balance on what could otherwise be a very tippy craft. There's a reason this has really never worked in my history on the Budget Committee, and that's because when you only look at appropriations, you get into a very familiar fight. So put it all together, and I think there's a chance for the craft to have much more resilience. The two phrases that have come the most frequently out of our effort have been debt to GDP and glide slope, because that's really what's at the heart of all of this. Once you get the mathematics right, you then have to figure out what your target is. And in our hearings, Bill Douster and many others testified that the target here is debt to GDP. There's not an absolute number, there's a relative number, debt to GDP. I don't think we had a witness who disagreed with that in all of the hearings that the Select Committee had or in all the hearings that the Budget Committee had. So that was an easy one. Debt to GDP should be the target, and we can have witnesses who will come in and testify what that ratio should be. What is sustainable? What is best case? What should America's debt to GDP ratio be? And then, because you don't want to do any immediate brutal shocks to the system, the economy doesn't respond well to immediate brutal shocks, you want to take some time to get from wherever we are now to that debt to GDP ratio decided on. So there's your glide slope. Could be 5 years, could be 10 years, could be 20 years. That's to be decided. But at least you have the mathematical elements of a budget all in place. You have a proper target that everybody agrees on, debt to GDP, and now you're trying to responsibly figure how long it takes you to get there. And then, of course, the last piece is along the way, you have to have some guardrails, some buzzers that start to buzz if you get off track so people can start paying attention to this. In a nutshell, that's what this bill builds. It started in the Select Committee as a purely voluntary alternative to the Senate budget process. And it passed unanimously in that bipartisan, bicameral Select Committee. The key to it was that you didn't get to go down that road unless you produced bipartisanship. You had to produce a majority of the majority and a majority of the minority in the Budget Committee, and you had to put 15 minority members voting for it on the floor to get to use that voluntary thing. You couldn't use it as a partisan rammer. You had to really sit down and be bipartisan to make it work. And Chairman Enzi liked it enough that he and his team took it and developed it into the replacement, not an addition, not the bipartisan bypass as we called it, but actually the replacement. And I think it's going to do much, much better when we can get it passed than the existing process, because it truly, truly is broken. Two last things that I'll say. One is, as an added bonus, it tends to disarm the debt limit. I describe the debt limit as a bear trap in the bedroom. At best, you walk around it and you never trigger it, at best. And it's harmless because you've successfully avoided it. At worst, someday, stupidly, or for some political reason, or however, you step in it. You can't get the votes, and there you are, and suddenly, whack. The testimony about what happens in that circumstance was really grim, both in the Select Committee and in the Budget Committee. So to disarm that nuclear device so it can't be used for political purposes, we do that through the so-called Gephardt Rule. And if you want to follow up with me about what the Gephardt Rule is, that's fine, but I think most of you probably know it, and it makes this a much longer and more tedious speech if I have to go through all the details. The last thing is that it keeps reconciliation. And there were two political, I think, important political concessions that we had to make here. One was, let's leave Social Security alone. We have bit off enough trying to solve this. So Social Security is not a part of it. It's just approach, tax spending, healthcare, and revenues. To me, that's enough. I'm proud of what we've done, and I have no intention to go any further. The second is we keep reconciliation. Reconciliation is kind of the relief valve for the Senate, so that the majority can get something big that it really wants to do done on a partisan vote. Basically, what the Budget Committee has become is a vehicle for the creation of reconciliation. We used it to push through the last piece of Obamacare when that was fouled up. The Republicans used it to push through the tax cuts when all the Democrats hated those. It's a support system for a vent to give you occasional relief from the filibuster. That's what the Budget Committee has become. So back to where I began, you want to know that the process is broken? Yeah. In this case, it is not just a truism. The process actually was broken. It didn't do the math right. It didn't set up the parameters to get to the goal that you wanted. And instead, we were using the time and the effort and the expertise of the senators on the Budget Committee to provide the support system for the relief valve for the filibuster. So I think that we have a real opportunity here. I think that the bipartisan vote in favor of it in the Budget Committee is a strong signal that if the opportunity presents itself through this legislation to have the Budget Committee actually take on these responsibilities in this kind of a bipartisan, broad-speaking way, I think my colleagues will step up to it. There'll be whiners, there'll be complainers, there'll be people who will be fussing about one thing or another. There'll probably be a certain amount of grandstanding against one idea or another. But I think that there is enough goodwill and enough desire to get this solved that we can put together substantial bipartisan majorities to begin to address this problem before debt becomes the only thing you care about. Thank you.
I want to say I hope you will join me in thanking Chairman Enzi and Senator Whitehouse and the great panelists we had today, and a big thanks to all of you for turning out. Thank you.